Hello, Brandon Baker with Crow Group here. Wanted to share with you a short safety meeting on confined space awareness. Now, this short session does not train you or give you the authorization to perform actual confined space entry. This is simply a confined space awareness course that will help you identify what may or may not be considered a confined space. And if you do encounter a confined space, what all actions are required to safely make entry and perform a task. The definition of a confined space, according to OSHA, a confined space has to meet these three criteria to be considered a confined space. Large enough for an employee to enter and perform work. It has a space that has a limited or restricted means for entry and exit, and it's not designed for continuous occupancy. Most confined spaces have one way in, one way out. It's a small manhole port. It's usually not a normal or regular sized door. You can see by this picture here, this is an example of going into what appears to be an above ground tank. There's two types of confined spaces, permit required and non-permit required. A permit required confined space is classified permit required if it has one or more of the following: the potential for a hazardous atmosphere, the potential for engulfment, or an internal configuration that could trap or asphyxiate an entrant, or any other recognized serious safety or health hazards. A non-permit required confined space basically has no hazards at all. There's no ability or opportunity to have a hazardous atmosphere, no potential for engulfment, no potential for the entrant to be trapped due to the internal configuration, such as downward sloping walls or any type of machinery or gear mechanisms inside the space. So here are a few types of permit required confined spaces: manholes, storage bins, equipment pits, vaults, mixing tanks. It can be a tanker truck, as you see here in the top right. Sewers, ventilation ducts, holding tanks, pipelines, boilers, and vats. So a permit required confined space has atmospheric hazards. Um, for the purpose of today's class, and this is always a good rule of thumb, anytime you encounter what you know as a confined space, you need to treat it like it is a permit required confined space. You need to treat it as if it has hazards, because until you test or do monitoring or know the layout, you don't know that it has no hazards, or you don't know that it's fine or clear, if that makes sense. So, one issue we deal with in any type of confined space is, does it have a hazardous atmosphere? Whether it's oxygen, whether it's a flammable gas, whether it's methane or hydrogen, toxic air contaminants such as hydrogen sulfide, or carbon monoxide. But we don't know if it has a hazardous atmosphere unless we test with a gas monitor. Now, a lot of your large industrial plants, your industrial sectors, even your manufacturing, they're required by OSHA to identify and label their confined spaces. But a lot of industry sectors don't, such as farming. You will seldom see a permit required confined space sticker on a silo, on a grain bin. And a lot of your larger or smaller facilities don't always have those labeled. So if you're going to do a job, going to perform work, or even going to bid a job, just because it doesn't have a sticker on it doesn't mean it's not a confined space. So you use this class to try to identify what confined spaces are out there that are labeled and that are not labeled. So how do we know if it has a hazardous atmosphere? Well, unless you monitor it, you don't know. Look at your oxygen levels. Anything less than 19.5% can cause suffocation. Anything that is greater than 23.5% of oxygen could be a flammable environment. So before you strike an arc or do any cutting or grinding, you definitely want to take that reading. Moving on, engulfment hazards. This could be grain, this could be fertilizer, this could be product of any type of sand. So let's say we don't have a hazardous atmosphere, but we have an engulfment hazard. You're going into a tank with product that is permit required confined space, whereas the entrant can be trapped or asphyxiated. Um, it could be anything: sand, gravel, plastic pellets, wood, sugar. Um, but it also must be continuously monitored to ensure the safety of the entrant from an atmospheric standpoint. And then monitoring can also include retrieval in the event of an emergency. Internal configurations. So even though it has a fine atmosphere, there's no potential for flammabilities, no low oxygen levels. It has no product in there that could trap you. Maybe the only hazard is the internal configuration, such as converging walls, baffles, downward sloping floors that taper to a smaller cross section that can make rescue or self rescue very difficult. Other hazards include mechanical hazards, energy sources, extreme temperatures, internal parts or equipment. Falling tools or objects can constitute a hazard, uneven or wet surfaces, and amplified noise levels. The problem with confined spaces is they're not so much difficult to get into, but if you have an emergency or an issue, they're hard to get out of. So if there's one person in that hole and that person goes down, how are you going to rescue that person? How are you going to get that person out? So there are so many tasks and so many regulations involved in permit required confined space entry, that OSHA really makes this a priority. And in confined spaces, more people are killed than are injured simply because the person goes down in there, they suffer an emergency and they can't get out, or it takes an extended amount of time for rescue to get there. So permit required confined spaces are very dangerous. And then again, mold, mildew, rodents, and bacteria, these are all things to consider as far as hazards in a permit required confined space. So, in a permit required confined space, entry permits are required. So basically, this permit goes over the name of the space you're entering, the purpose of the entry, the date and the authorized duration of the entry, the names of the supervisor, the attendant, and the entrant on this task, and the hazards of the space. Basically, a confined space entry permit is a checklist. It's a checklist for you to go through and ensure that all the hazards are addressed, all the hazards are abated or eliminated or locked and tagged before you make entry. Because if you cannot eliminate a hazard, why would you go into that space? So you do the monitoring, you do the lockout tag out, you document all that on the permit, and you ensure that all the hazards are corrected and that work can be performed without the possibility of an injury. Now, if you do this permit and you can't check off that you've locked it out, or you can't check off that you've monitored the atmosphere, you cannot enter that space. You're not supposed to enter that space because there are still hazards in that space. Now we go back to, we mentioned non-permit required confined space. What if you have a brand new water system that you're building? You have an exposed ditch, you're setting a water line, and you're setting a precast concrete manhole. Well, theoretically, you need to consider that a permit required confined space until you've monitored the air. There's no issues. There's fresh air. Check that off. There's no inwardly converging walls, no equipment, no mechanical hazards. The water line's not even hooked up. So, for all intents and purposes, you can enter that space without having to have a confined space entry permit because there are no hazards. You can document that on your daily job report, on your JSA, that you checked everything. There are no hazards. We made entry to do this job without having to go through all the steps of a per se permit required confined space. But remember, a non-permit required confined space basically has zero hazards. Continuing on the entry permit, um, you document what measures are used to isolate the permit space or eliminate or control its hazards, what equipment will be used to detect the hazardous atmosphere. What are considered acceptable entry conditions? What's your communication procedure? You need to be in constant contact with that entrant, with that person in that confined space, so you know, is there an issue? Is there a problem? And the equipment that's used during the entry operation. That confined space entry permit is your Bible. It is what you do to get your game plan set to make sure that that task that you're performing in that space, you can do it flawlessly and without injury or illness. You'll also document on there the phone numbers for rescue services and then the instructions for rescue, um, and the results of the air testing that was completed. So let's say we're going to perform a permit required confined space entry. It takes a minimum of 3 people to do this. You have your entrant, that is the individual that goes in there to do the work. You have the attendant. They're the person outside of the hole, outside of the entry. Sometimes you may have heard them called hole watches. They remain outside of the space and they monitor the entrant. They're in constant communication with that entrant, whether it's by radio or whether it's verbally. And then you have your supervisor. They're the individual that reviews, signs off on the permit, double checks the air readings, makes sure the air readings are done, verifies lockout, tagout is complete. They just double and triple check to make sure that all hazards that are present in that space have been abated and that entrant can safely do their work. Each role must be represented in every entry operation on a confined space, on a permit required confined space job. Each team member must have the knowledge to perform their job safely in a permit space, and each team member must be trained on the permit space hazards. And the entry team must work together to ensure a safe entry. So let's look at these 3 roles, and we're going to start with the entrant. The entrant must be aware of the permit space hazards. They must be aware of the symptoms and effects of exposure to whatever is in that environment. Maybe it was simply a lack of oxygen. Maybe it used to store ammonia. Maybe it used to store a fertilizer. Maybe it used to store liquid chlorine. The whole team needs to understand what was that space used for. Then you can research what are some side effects, if any, of what was in that space. Maybe it's a simple lack of oxygen. That's a space that has been closed up for years. There's no ventilation. It tests good on the monitor, but if the entrant starts to experience dizziness, sleepiness, breathing difficulties, confusion, these are all red flags that the entrant should say to the attendant, let me out. Let's evacuate. Something's going on. They should know how to use all the equipment needed during an entry operation. They should keep the attendant informed of their status during entry while they're working down there, and then communicate any condition changes in the permit space and evacuate the space immediately if ordered to do so by the attendant. There are warning signs or symptoms of exposure to a product, or maybe it's just the atmosphere, or an evacuation alarm is activated. Now let's look at the duties of the attendant, the hole watch, the person responsible for the entrant. Again, these duties mirror the entrant. The attendant needs to be aware of the permit space hazards, know how to use testing, monitoring, communication, and non-entry rescue equipment, monitor the entrant at all times during entry, verbal communication in one way or another, whether it's word of mouth or whether it's through the radio system. Monitor the activities inside and outside of the space. Maintain, again, constant communication with the entrant, and then order the entrant to evacuate if a prohibited condition is detected, behavior of the entrant has changed, a dangerous situation outside of the space occurs, or the attendant cannot perform all duties and has not been relieved. You don't want to keep a person down there 8 hours. Maybe 1 hour is long enough. Is it a high temp environment? Is it a cold weather environment? These are all things that should be discussed before the operation takes place and communicated across the team. Duties of the attendant continued. Warn unauthorized personnel approaching the space to stay away. Advise unauthorized persons that have entered the space to exit immediately, to stay away. Inform the unauthorized entrant. Inform the authorized entrant and the entry supervisor if unauthorized employees enter the space. And then they should have no other duties that might interfere with their ability to assess and protect the authorized entrant. No cell phone, no texting, no cleaning or picking up, or don't do anything other than make sure that entrant is safe. No other distractions. Maintain an accurate count of the entrants when there are multiple entrants, and then summon a rescue team or emergency services if needed, and then perform non-entry rescue. So you say, what's a non-entry rescue? That is, you have the person down in the hole, the entrance in the hole in the confined space, and they are attached to a tripod system with a winch by a body harness. You know, the attendant should be able to crank on the winch, lift the person out of the space without physically going into the space. That is performing a non-entry rescue. And they are to remain outside of the permit space until the operation is complete or until they're relieved by another trained attendant. Now let's look at duties of the supervisor. Be aware of the permit space hazards, review the entry permit, verify that all tests specified on the permit have been conducted and they're within the acceptable ranges. All procedures and equipment are in place. Rescue services are available. They're to sign the permit to authorize entry, remove all unauthorized personnel from the area, and record any problems occurring during the entry on the permit. And it's also their responsibility to suspend or cancel the permit when an unsafe condition arises in or near the permit space. But again, we go back to our stop work. At any time, anybody has the ability to stop the job on a confined space, permit required confined space entry. And then cancel and file the permit when entry operations have been completed. You never throw it away, you file it away. So let's look at the responsibilities that we have to do before we make entry. These are just responsibilities of everybody. The entry team readies the permit space area, which includes assembling the equipment, obtaining the permit, verifying hazards are eliminated or controlled from outside the space, and ensuring barriers are securely in place to prevent unauthorized people from accidentally entering that operation. They remove the permit space cover once all unsafe conditions are eliminated. The atmosphere in the permit space is tested in order for oxygen level readings, flammable gases, vapors, and toxic air contaminants to be known if they are present, if any of these hazards are present. Again, we never enter a space unless we monitor first, assess first, control the hazards. Knowledge is power. Um, Everything is recorded on the permit, oxygen levels, LELs, that's your lower explosive limit. Um, Anything and everything you can think of is recorded on the permit. The permit is posted near the entrance of the space. This lets everybody know in that area that you are following the procedures. If you work in an area where there are confined spaces and you see what you know of as a permit required confined space entry going on, and you don't see a permit required, you don't see an air monitor, you don't see maybe retrieval, that's a red flag. Should probably say something. The authorized entrant verifies they're wearing the proper PPE, they're wearing a body harness with a lanyard, unless the equipment would interfere with a rescue. While inside the permit space, periodic or continuous atmospheric monitoring must be conducted, just to ensure that oxygen levels stay stay in the acceptable ranges. We don't have a change in flammable gases, vapors, or mists. We don't have a change in airborne dust. Maybe the atmosphere is one way when you enter. You start performing work, whether it's welding, cutting, or grinding, and that will change the atmosphere. That's why it's important to do, it says periodic, I like continuous. But if you're in a small space and you're welding or cutting or burning, the atmosphere is going to change. That's why that monitoring is so important, and that verbal communication with that entrant is important. And then also, if you have any air contaminants that happen to appear or are developed while you're performing that work. Here's a good picture of what's involved in an entry operation. You can see there's forced air ventilation going on. This is the attendant lowering the entrant in using a winch, full body harness cable, and this is likely your supervisor. Engulfment hazards must also be continuously monitored. Dust is flammable. Effective communication is maintained between the attendant and the entrant, whether it's verbal, hand signals. Don't like hand signals because not all the time you can see them, but you need to have a form of communication. If you cannot see the person, you have to hear them. If you can't see them and you can't hear them, you need to get them out. Once the entry is complete, the space should be secured, put back in a safe working order. The completed or canceled permit is then filed away. You keep a copy if it's with you. Maybe the client you're working for requires that. Give them a copy. You keep a copy. Always have your documentation. Always protect yourself. So, a confined space rescue team. Anytime you're going to do a permit required confined space operation, you have to have a rescue team on standby and available. This isn't just the attendant or whatever. This is a designated rescue team aside from the entrant, attendant, and the supervisor. It can be an outside agency or it can be a trained team of company employees. But let's say you're going to use the local fire department. Well, first, you have to make sure that that fire department has confined space rescue capabilities and they are available. So, just some things to think about. Rescue personnel must have the knowledge, skills, and equipment to safely execute a rescue in your company's permit spaces. They must be trained on all the specific hazards of the permit spaces. They must be on call for all confined space entry operations, have the capability to reach a victim within an appropriate time frame for the hazards present in the permit space, and they must know basic first aid and CPR. If you're going to do a permit required confined space and your company doesn't have a team and you're going to rely on the fire department and they're not available, you shouldn't be doing the rescue. You can't do the rescue. The team has to be available and be on call. Some more on teams, outside rescue teams. They must be assessed and approved by your company to perform permit required confined spaces in a timely manner. They must have access to your company's permit spaces for training, and they must be familiar with the hazards in your company's permit spaces. So let's say you're working in a factory. Well, that fire department or that emergency services team must be familiar with the confined spaces in that factory that you're working. And they must have at least trained there once or be familiar with it or have the equipment. In-house rescue teams, they must be familiar with the confined spaces that you're working in. And you have to do a practice. Practice rescues are not necessary if the team properly performed an actual rescue operation in the same or a similar permit space during the last 12 months. But hopefully nobody has to make rescues. But if you don't ever rescue anybody, that team has to train at minimum of once a year and conduct a practice rescue. A lot of stuff goes into confined space rescue and entry. The practice may be substituted if the team properly performed an actual rescue operation in the same or similar space, but it's always good to practice as a team. Time is critical in a rescue. I think a person can only be suspended for 30 minutes or less in a full body harness. Time is critical. Contact a trained rescue team immediately. This means that you've already pre-contacted them to make sure they are available to respond. Perform a non-entry rescue to remove the authorized entrant if possible. Someone should always be hooked up to a tripod with a lanyard or with a winch and a full body harness. Never attempt to rescue someone inside a permit space unless you're trained and equipped to do so. So, in conclusion, permit required confined spaces are dangerous places. Follow the procedures of your company's written program and of your client's written program. Know the hazards of the permit spaces you work in. Know your duties during an operation and keep yourself and your team safe. Thank you very much.